what type of sports, what type of classes do you take if you want to get into sports reporting?
Uh-huh.
And also, what was your favorite type of game that you got to call as a commentator?
Okay.
So, um, first off, what type of classes when you were in high school and college did you get to take for uh, like just commentating in general?
Well, I went to Syracuse, which has a really good journalism school called the Newhouse School. And I knew from the time I was about your age, to be honest with you, I knew I wanted to get into sportscasting, and that's the main reason why I decided to go to Syracuse. And so immediately I was a broadcast journalism major. So there's journalism, which is obviously writing, newspaper reporting, working for a website, something like that. And then there's broadcast journalism, which is what I do. It's journalism, but it's on television. And I knew I wanted to be on TV. But the great thing about Syracuse is that they basically made you take all writing classes up until your junior year before you could even start being on television as a junior. So my foundation when I started college was all, you know, traditional journalism. It was all about writing, it was about grammar, it was about spelling and punctuation, and then all the things that good reporters do, asking smart questions, being curious, doing your research, making sure you have all the facts straight. And then there's, next level things, which are taking classes on how to do that. Because one of the things that you have to do is you have to get what's called attribution. So if someone came to me and told me a story about you and said, "Yeah, I heard he's cheating on his English test," I couldn't write an article about that. But if I came to you and asked you, and maybe asked your friend or your mom or your teacher, that's called attribution. Then I could write an article about it and say, I spoke to him and he said he's never cheated on an English test in his life. Things like that. So it all started by going to Syracuse. I worked on my high school newspaper before that. But that was really all I could do in high school. I did some announcing for the high school football team and for the high school basketball team, but we didn't have television. It was just, public address announcing. And then when I got to Syracuse, it was there were lots of opportunities to work at the student radio stations, the student TV stations, and take all these classes with all these great professors, surrounded by a bunch of guys my age who now I look around and they're all over the place in my profession, which is really pretty neat.
That's really cool there, especially with all the different types of classes that you got to take at a
Mm-hmm.
younger age. Um, while I was seeing you on ESPN call the Kansas game, I was interested to know if you do your own notes or does somebody else give you notes beforehand? How does
That's
that
a
work?
great question, and the answer isn't as simple as yes or no. It's a little bit of both. So I am a research hound, and as a matter of fact, let me see. I have my Kansas notes right here in front of me, and I don't know if you'll be able to see it that well, but um, these are what are called boards, and you have them in football, you have them in basketball, and in baseball it's a little different. You have a scorebook. I don't know if you've ever seen that,
Yeah,
but this is how I make my notes and how I get prepared for each and every team. And so all of that, as you can see, is handwritten. A lot of announcers these days use computer programs, but the way that I was taught was handwriting because we didn't have computer programs when I was coming up. So I tend to remember things better when I write them down. So that's the way I still do it. And once I compile all that information, there are people who work for each of the teams, and they're called SIDs. That stands for Sports Information Directors. And the ones for each of the two teams that you're covering, which for me yesterday was Kansas and Oklahoma, you get in touch with them usually a handful of days before the game, and they send out notes. And the notes are sometimes like 30 something pages long. So it has storylines, it has facts and figures, it has certainly a lot of statistics and things like that. And then I read through the notes, and if there's interesting things on that, I add that to the notes that I already have written down. And by the time, the goal is, by the time I sit down at center court and the ball is thrown up for the opening tip, I feel like I know all of these players and each of these teams inside and out. So you're really not ever looking down at these all that much, other than I keep track of everybody's individual scoring. I'm not looking at this for information as much as I'm looking at it for reference. So if, like, I'm looking at this right now, and if Jalen Wilson goes to the free throw line, I know I'm going to have a little bit of extra time in the game to look down and say, is there anything special about Jalen Wilson, a really interesting story that I think would fit here because I have a few extra seconds because the time has stopped on the clock. And maybe I'll see something on my notes that I've written down and say, oh, yeah, I really wanted to mention that. And then I would. But a lot of it is just going over it time and time again before the game starts so that you feel comfortable knowing who those guys are. Certainly names and numbers are the most important thing. I have all of that memorized. So if you said to me, who's number 10 on Kansas, I'd be able to tell you right off the bat. Number 10 is Jalen Wilson. Number 2 is Christian Brown. 22 on Oklahoma is Davion Harmon. 35 is Brady Manick. I know all these guys because I committed them to memory. But there's too much other information to have it all memorized. And I don't know if you know by a guy by the name of Mike Tirico. He's one of the most famous sportscasters out there. He went to Syracuse. He worked for ESPN. Now he works for NBC. And Mike's a few years older than me. And he always said what I follow by. He calls it the 10% rule. And you do all of this work. And this is just for one team. So, again, this is what a board looks like because I have it for 2 teams. You do all of that work and all of that research and all of that writing, you end up using about 10% of it in the game. And if you do, that probably means you had a good game because the game was exciting. If the game is boring, you might get to a lot more of this information. But if the game's exciting, then you let the game tell the story. And then all the extra stuff that you wrote down and you did research on, you just kind of sprinkle in as the game goes on. And if you use about 10% of it, the 10% rule means you had a pretty good game.
Well, that's good to know. I was just wondering that while you were in the game, you were talking about some of the stats and some of the facts. I was seeing that was pretty cool that you know the numbers like that.
Yeah, you're not the only one. Most people say that to me all the time. They go, how do you remember all that stuff? And the fact is, the secret is, I don't remember it all. I have it written down in front of me. But that's what research is.
This is a multiple 2-question part. What's the favorite sport that you get to commentate, and what was the favorite game? Like, what was the best game that you got to commentate?
Wow, that's the second one's a tough one. My favorite sport, I would have to say, is definitely college basketball. So I spent half my year calling college basketball games, and I spent half my year covering the Tampa Bay Rays in Major League Baseball. Not that I don't love covering the Rays and I don't love baseball, because I do. Baseball was my first real sport that I played growing up. I grew up in New Jersey. I was a big Yankees fan back then. But I've always had a passion for basketball. And I've been working for ESPN calling college basketball games now for 11 years, I think it is. And there's nothing quite as exciting as sitting center court for a really big game. And I've been lucky, to be honest with you. It's hard to say what my favorite game was or my biggest game, but a few years ago, I was covering a team that plays in Kansas called Wichita State.
Mm-hmm.
And they happened to go undefeated all the way into the NCAA tournament. And I was covering a lot of their games, and I happened to be calling their final game of their regular season, and it was at home. It was in Wichita. And if they won, they would have been completing a regular season undefeated, which not a lot of college basketball teams have ever done. And that was probably the biggest game that I've called. The most exciting game I called would probably have to be a few years back in the NIT tournament. ESPN unfortunately doesn't get the NCAA tournament, the Big Dance, March Madness. So we do what's the NIT tournament, and teams that don't make the NCAA tournament play in the NIT. And I was calling a quarterfinal game in the NIT tournament, and it was between Old Dominion and Murray State. And Murray State was a really good team, and Old Dominion was kind of the Cinderella, and they ended up winning the game on a three-pointer, and it was like a bomb. It was like 35 feet. And the guy's name was Trey Freeman, and I just remember that moment more than anything. I could close my eyes and picture being there when that happened. And it was just awesome. And not only was it awesome, but it was memorable for me because I remembered nailing that call. Like, I didn't choke, you know? The guy made the shot, and I made the call, and I think it was good, and I think it captured the excitement and all of that. So that was probably the biggest and most memorable game that I called, when Trey Freeman hit that prayer of a three-pointer to win the game for Old Dominion, and then they went on to play in Madison Square Garden, which is a dream come true for every basketball player.
Yeah, that was a cool shot, I bet. And just remembering that moment is always good to know that it was a big moment in the game there. I was also wondering, what are the COVID protocols like nowadays? What did you have to do when you got into the arena?
Can I pause here for a second and pay you a compliment?
Yeah.
You were asked really good questions. And how old are you?
I'm 17.
That's unbelievable. You're so far ahead of where I was at 17 years old. So salute to you for these good questions.
Thanks.
COVID protocol is different. It's different for every school I go to. It's different at home. I've split my season like a lot of announcers, doing games from my living room, where I literally have to call the game on a big monitor that ESPN has sent me and a camera that they've sent me. And I'm basically announcing the game, watching the same thing that you're watching at home. So we don't have different angles. We certainly don't see the referees and the coaches like we normally do when we're in person. So as you can imagine, that's pretty tough. But the COVID protocol for that, there isn't any because I'm home. So I'm isolated. When I go on the road, like I was this past weekend for Kansas, Oklahoma, we have to take a COVID test 5 days prior, and we send it out. We order the test. They mail it to our house. We take the test at our house. I send it in via FedEx to this company. The company sends it back, the results, in 24 hours. So basically, I do the test Monday. I send it in. By Wednesday, I know if I tested positive or negative. And knock wood, I've tested negative every single time this season. And that means I'm clear to travel. So the next day I travel, and then the day after that is the game. And that's the COVID protocol for ESPN. Then when we get to the games, it really is based on where you are. So in Oklahoma, they had us sitting right at the court side, but pushed farther back than we normally were. So there wasn't anybody within 30 feet of us. So everybody was socially distanced and safe, except for me and my partner, Fran Fraschilla. We were about 6 feet apart. So that doesn't meet protocol, so we had to wear a mask the whole time. If you're more than that apart, I think the number is 15 feet. If you're 15 feet apart, you can take your mask down. If you're closer than that, you have to put your mask on. But that said, I've been at other arenas where they wouldn't even allow us to sit courtside. We had to sit in the what's called like the mezzanine or the concourse level, where it's in between the first level of fans and the second level of fans, and they set up a table for us there. Again, it's just being better safe than sorry. So we are super far away from everybody. So there's no chance that we would get even close to the teams or the officials or whoever else may or may not be there. But those are determined by the schools and by the states that those schools are in, and also by the conferences that those schools play in. All of those things come into play with COVID protocols this year.
Well, That's good to know that there's different types of like going at your house and then being at the game. That's pretty big difference there while the
Yeah.
season is happening too. Um, the final question, which I really would like to hear your answer here. What is something that you wish you would have done differently in your career path?
Another good question. I try not to have any regrets, and I think that's just a good measure of advice for anybody in any career and any life choice you make. Live your life with no regrets. I wouldn't go as far to say as everything happens for a reason, because sometimes, bad things happen and there shouldn't be any reason for that. But I will say this: had I known that I'd be doing now what I am when I was younger and starting out, I might have made a couple of different career choices than I did. So one of the things that now I'm kind of proud of is that I didn't take a direct route into being a play-by-play announcer like so many of my colleagues did. There is no one secret sauce to becoming a play-by-play announcer for a national sports network. And I think I'm a perfect example of that. So when I was fairly young and I moved down to the Tampa Bay area, which is where I live now, there's a network down here called Home Shopping Network, and it is what you think it is. They sell stuff on TV, and I became one of their hosts because they wanted me to sell sports stuff, and I was a sportscaster, but they offered me more money than I had seen as a young 20-something-year-old guy, and I was still working in sports, but it wasn't sports casting. And I decided to go for it, and it was a little bit of a gamble, and I spent 8 years there. And I was still able to do some work on the outside of that, which was sports related, but it was never college basketball or Major League Baseball, things that I really wanted to get into. So at some points, I felt pretty frustrated by that because I said, here I have a full-time job. I'm making a good amount of money, but I'm not doing what I really want to do. And at times I felt like I had wasted all of that time when I could have been doing work for ESPN if I had been lucky enough to get a job back then. But all of that is, they say hindsight is 2020. All of that is just in hindsight. Some of the things that now I realize that I learned while having that job was how to speak extemporaneously, which is a big fancy SAT word for saying you're able to speak off the cuff. You have enough confidence in your vocabulary and the elements of the English language, which I learned in college, like we talked about earlier, that you can speak without a script. And I learned that working at Home Shopping Network. So those things, plus I got to do a lot of cool stuff, interview a lot of cool people. I covered 8 straight Super Bowls, excuse me, when I was there. So again, I don't regret doing that. I don't wish I did things differently because I'm very happy with where I am now. But I'll always be curious that at that point in time, if I hadn't taken that job and if I had tried a little harder to get a job at ESPN, how would things be different? I'll never know, but that's what makes life interesting.
Well, yeah. That's all the questions that I have for you. But I just want to say thank you so much for having me interview you. This was such an honor, and I loved this. Thank you so much.
The honor was all mine. I had a blast answering your questions, and I mean that sincerely. You asked really good questions, so that tells me a couple things. You're confident and you're prepared, and those two things will get you a long way. What would your dream job be?
Probably broadcasting for MLB or basketball. That's what I want to be.
Yeah, who do you root for?
The Cubs.
Oh, you're a Cubs? Is that how you know Noah?
Mm-hmm.
You're both Cubs fans?
Yep.
Yeah, well, if you love baseball, then you are very lucky because John Shambi, who is a friend of mine and is now going to be the play-by-play voice for the Cubs on TV, he's as good as it gets.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the more you listen to him, the more you'll learn. And I would say, follow his lead, but find your own voice. At some point when you start practicing this kind of stuff, you'll realize that you can't imitate other people. You can emulate them, but don't imitate other people. Just be who you are, and that'll be good enough for you down the road getting a job.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right, take care and stay in touch with me. I want to know how you keep doing as you get older.
All right, I will.